In roughly a 75 to 15 to 10 ratio, three ordinary substances, saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur, combined to produce a chemical reaction violent enough to have ended 8 centuries of armored knights dominating European warfare. And monks in 9th century China discovered that exact ratio by accident while trying to formulate a potion for eternal life. Somewhere in the mountains of Sichuan or Shaanxi province, a group of Taoist alchemists were pursuing something that had nothing whatsoever to do with warfare. They believed the right combination of minerals could grant immortality, and they spent years mixing, heating, and experimenting with whatever substances tradition and instinct handed them, following recipes passed down through generations of mystical and medicinal practice. At some point, one particular batch combined those three ingredients, and instead of granting eternal life, it did something considerably more dramatic. It exploded. Singed beards and burned down workshops litter the early historical record, which tells you everything about how that first encounter actually went. Nobody in that room was trying to invent a weapon. They named the resulting substance Huayao, fire medicine, a name that still carries the faint, slightly embarrassing memory of its original purpose as a failed pharmaceutical rather than a future engine of conquest. And yet that one accidental, beard-singeing batch of failed immortality medicine eventually became the single most consequential chemical discovery in the history of human conflict, the seed from which every gun, every cannon, and eventually every firearm on Earth would grow. So how do you get from a botched elixir in a mountain laboratory to a rifle capable of ending a knight's 400-year reign on the battlefield? The answer runs through bamboo tubes strapped to spears, a siege that proved the new technology actually worked, and centuries of quiet, incremental refinement carried across an entire continent by armies who had no idea they were reshaping the future of every inhabited landmass on Earth. Understanding the basic chemistry helps explain why everything that followed happened the way it did. The saltpeter, known chemically as potassium nitrate, acted as an oxidizer, releasing oxygen rapidly when heated and feeding an extremely fast combustion reaction that produced a sudden, violent expansion of gas. That expanding gas is the entire secret behind everything gunpowder would eventually be used for, whether that meant launching fireworks into a night sky or launching a metal projectile through armor plate. And for a surprisingly long stretch of history, it was almost exclusively the former. In its earliest documented uses, gunpowder wasn't weaponized at all. It lit up festivals, punctuated religious ceremonies, sent smoke signals across valleys. For generations, ordinary people across China encountered this substance primarily as spectacle, color, and noise with nothing to do with combat. It would be worth asking yourself, at this point, how many of history's deadliest technologies started out this way, as entertainment, as accident, as something nobody thought to fear. That changed once Song Dynasty military commanders got a look at what this volatile substance could actually do. Between the 10th and 12th centuries, Chinese engineers developed the huachang, or fire lance, a weapon about as simple as a weapon could possibly be. Take a length of bamboo, strap it to the end of a spear, pack the tube with gunpowder, and light it during close combat. The result was a polearm that spewed flame and burning debris at anyone within arm's reach, and defenders used it during the Siege of Dawn in 1132 against attackers scaling their walls. By every account, it worked exactly as intended. Soldiers who had trained their entire lives to fight with blades and spears suddenly faced an enemy who could project fire itself, and that kind of psychological shock often mattered as much on a medieval battlefield as the physical damage inflicted. Once gunpowder had proven itself in actual combat, innovation accelerated, and each improvement followed almost obviously from whatever came before it. Fire lance makers began stuffing pellets and pottery shards into the bamboo tubes alongside the powder, shifting the weapon's purpose from pure intimidation toward genuine, penetrating injury at a distance, the foundational concept behind every firearm that would follow. Bamboo, though, couldn't hold the pressure that stronger charges generated, and it occasionally burst apart in the user's own hands. Once craftsmen learned to cast bronze tubes strong enough to contain that pressure safely, the hand cannon was born, and by the 13th century metal-barreled hand cannons were already in regular use across China. Engineers scaled the concept upward too, producing devices with names like the thunderclap bomb and the heaven-shaking cannon. weapons capable of reducing fortifications that had previously seemed unassailable. When the Mongols invaded China in the 1200s, they encountered these weapons firsthand during sieges like the defense of Kaifeng in 1232, and rather than simply being defeated by the new technology, they absorbed it. Once they controlled China and established the Yuan dynasty, they carried gunpowder weaponry westward with them into new conquests across Asia and toward the Islamic world. This is one of history's more underappreciated technology transfers, because Mongol military campaigns functioned almost like an accidental delivery system, spreading a Chinese invention across the breadth of Eurasia within a few generations, faster than trade caravans or diplomacy ever could have managed alone. Gunpowder technology didn't move in a single straight line either. Alongside hand cannons, Chinese engineers developed rockets and fire arrows, propelled projectiles that found separate use in Korea and India, a distinct branch of the same discovery that would resurface centuries later in European warfare, and later still in the earliest ancestors of modern rocketry. One accidental discovery, two entirely different destinies. From there, gunpowder reached the Islamic world and eventually Europe through military contact, trade, and the broader wave of cross-cultural exchange defining the 13th and 14th centuries, traveling the same general routes as paper, printing, and the magnetic compass, part of a much larger current of knowledge moving east to west long before anyone had coined the word globalization. Some historians note that early European cannons resemble Chinese designs so closely that direct transfer seems far more plausible than coincidence. Once the technology landed in Europe in the late 13th century, it entered a political and military order it would spend the following centuries dismantling, eventually helping bring down a feudal system that had stood for hundreds of years. The transformation wasn't instant. Early European hand cannons were crude, slow, difficult to aim, essentially small cannons mounted awkwardly on poles, loaded by hand and fired by touching a smoldering ember to a hole and hoping for the best. But even in this primitive form, castle walls that had withstood traditional siege equipment for generations began falling to cannon fire, and mounted knights, the dominant military force across medieval Europe, found themselves vulnerable to a weapon that didn't care how much steel they wore. A relatively cheap tool in the hands of a far less expensively trained soldier could now neutralize a man who had spent a fortune and a lifetime preparing for war the old way. As cannons grew more powerful, the tall, thin walls of the medieval castle became dangerously obsolete almost overnight in historical terms, replaced by the low, angled, thickly reinforced star forts and bastions engineered specifically to deflect and absorb cannon fire. An architectural form that had defined the European landscape for centuries was erased by a weapon born half a world away in the hands of monks chasing eternal life. Here's where it's worth pausing to ask yourself which single invention in this chain actually mattered most, because the next one is the moment everything genuinely changes, and I'd love to know your answer in the comments once you've heard it. The late 15th century brought the matchlock mechanism, and this is the development that finally turned gunpowder weapons from clumsy novelties into the backbone of organized infantry warfare. Earlier hand cannons required two hands and near impossible coordination, one to steady the weapon, the other to touch a burning cord to the powder at exactly the right instant, all while aiming at a moving target. The matchlock solved this by attaching a slow-burning cord, held in a curved clamp called a serpentine, directly to the weapon. Pulling the trigger lowered that already burning cord into a pan of priming powder, freeing the shooter to hold and aim with both hands. It was the first mechanical firing device ever applied to a small arm, and for the first time in history, a single trained soldier could fire with something resembling real precision. By the early 15th century, matchlock arquebus were spreading across Western Europe, into the Ottoman Janissary Corps, into Portuguese forces at the Battle of Gio in 1510, and by 1543 into Japan, where local gunsmiths refined the design into the Tanegashima, prized even by European observers for its craftsmanship. China itself, having started the entire chain centuries earlier, ended up reabsorbing an improved version of its own invention to counter Mongol incursions along its northern frontier, a strange and fitting loop for a technology born in that same general region. Matchlock muskets grew heavy enough to need a forked rest, some weighing as much as 25 pounds, but capable of punching through plate armor at ranges that made swords and pikes increasingly irrelevant. Because reloading left musketeers briefly vulnerable, they needed pikemen beside them, and this combination of pike and shot dominated European battlefields into the 17th century. But the matchlock had one glaring weakness everyone understood immediately. It needed an open flame at all times, useless in rain, and impossible to conceal in darkness. The wheel lock arrived in the early 16th century, using a spring-loaded wheel spun against pyrite to generate sparks without a burning cord, popular with cavalry who needed a weapon ready without tending an open flame on horseback, though its expense kept it from ever replacing the cheaper matchlock among ordinary infantry. The true breakthrough came with the flintlock, generally credited to French gunsmith Marin Le Bourgeois around 1610 to 1615, using a spring-loaded hammer holding flint to strike sparks directly into the priming pan. Faster, more reliable in bad weather, requiring no open flame to maintain at all. By the 1630s, it had spread across Europe, and within decades it dominated essentially every major military on the continent, a position it held for roughly 2 centuries, through the Napoleonic Wars and the American Revolution, where flintlock muskets carried by colonial militias and British regulars defined the entire conflict. Alongside the flintlock came the socket bayonet in the late 17th century, attaching around the barrel rather than plugging into the muzzle, meaning a soldier could fire and still keep his bayonet fixed. Armies no longer needed dedicated pikemen, since every soldier could now function as shooter and spearman depending on the moment, a single change that simplified training, simplified logistics, and reshaped how European armies organized themselves entirely. The flintlock's 2-century reign finally ended in the early 19th century with the percussion cap, a small metal cap that ignited instantly when struck, eliminating loose powder, flint, and steel altogether, and rendering every mechanism before it obsolete within a few decades. From there, the pace only accelerated toward repeating rifles and manufacturing advances that would have been unrecognizable to the soldiers who once stood in disciplined lines waiting their turn to fire. Looking back across this entire arc, from a Taoist alchemy lab in 9th century China to flintlock muskets dominating European battlefields nearly 8 centuries later, the story of how humans invented guns is really a story about accident, accumulation, and migration unfolding together across an enormous span of time. Nobody set out on day one to build a firearm. A group of monks looking for eternal life stumbled onto an explosive reaction and very nearly burned their own beards off in the process. Every refinement after that, bamboo to bronze, open flame to spring-loaded mechanism, matchlock to flintlock, solved the specific practical problem soldiers had actually encountered with whatever came before it. None of it required a single genius moment of total invention. It required centuries of incremental refinement carried across continents by trade routes, military campaigns, and the kind of slow cultural exchange that quietly reshapes the world while almost nobody is watching closely enough to notice it happening in real time, passing between Chinese engineers, Mongol conquerors, Ottoman janissaries, Japanese gunsmiths, and European craftsmen, each adding their own small refinement along the way. The weapon that would end the dominance of mounted knights, reshape castle architecture, and ultimately decide the outcome of colonial conquests and continental wars across multiple centuries began its existence as a mistake, made by people who were never trying to build a weapon at all. If that kind of accidental history is the kind of thing you want more of, you know exactly what to do before the next one shows up in your feed.